He was a homeless father who had lost everything except his faith in his son. When fate unexpectedly gave him a chance, an old container filled with junk, everyone laughed. But what he found inside changed their lives forever. Subscribe to the channel, write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The wind howled beneath the overpass, carrying with it the scent of oil, rust, and wet concrete. Somewhere above, the city never slept. Its ceaseless hum of tires and horns, a reminder that life moved on, indifferent to those who had fallen from its pace. Beneath that roar, a man stirred in the shadows. John Marshall blinked against the pale glow of a distant street lamp as he pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around his shoulders. The cold had found its way into his bones long before winter arrived. Next to him, under layers of blankets that had once been someone else's curtains, his 8-year-old son, Sam, slept curled into a small bundle of warmth and trust. John watched him breathe for a long moment, his chest rising and falling softly, before he reached out to adjust the edge of the blanket over the boy's face. The morning was gray and bitter, one of those days when the air seemed to freeze even thought itself. John rose carefully, so as not to wake the boy, and rubbed his hands together for warmth. His fingers were cracked and raw, a map of the years since life had turned against him. He looked toward the end of the underpass, where an old shopping cart leaned against a concrete pillar, filled with the sum total of their world. A few cans, a chipped metal pot, 2 plastic bottles of water, a blanket that smelled of mildew, and a single photograph, creased, faded, and kept in a sandwich bag to protect it from the rain. It showed a smiling woman with gentle eyes, her arm wrapped around a younger John, her other hand resting on Sam's shoulders. Maria, his wife. The last time she had been well enough to smile like that was before the hospital bills, before the foreclosure notices, before the garage door had shut for the final time on the business he built with his own hands. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the traffic above and remembering what silence used to sound like. Then Sam stirred, opening his eyes, their brown depths clouded with sleep. "Is it morning already?" he mumbled. "It's as morning as it gets," John said quietly. "Come on, kiddo. We've got bottles to collect before someone else gets there first." They packed their things with the practiced rhythm of survival and began the walk toward the recycling yard. Their shoes squelched in the slush, their breath rising in faint clouds. Every sound, the clink of bottles, the rattle of the cart felt louder in the cold emptiness of dawn. By noon, they had earned $4.60, enough for 2 sandwiches and a cup of coffee, if they were careful. They sat behind a gas station, sharing one sandwich and saving the other for later. Sam chewed in silence, his gaze fixed on the road where cars sped past. To him, every passing driver was part of another world, one where people had heat and roofs and doors that locked. John followed his gaze, wondering, not for the first time, if the line between those worlds was as thin as it had felt the day he lost everything. He had been one of those drivers once, just another man on his way to work, whistling to the radio. Now he and his boy were ghosts in plain sight. In the afternoon, they made their way to the shelter. It was Friday, which meant hot soup and a line that wrapped around the block. The smell of broth drifted out into the freezing air. They stood among dozens of others, some drunk, some silent, some humming tuneless songs to themselves. Sam leaned against his father's arm, his eyelids heavy. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed weakly, illuminating posters of smiling volunteers. On one of the bulletin boards next to a list of free clinics and emergency food pantries, a new flyer caught John's eye. It was bright yellow, hand-lettered in thick black marker. "Charity Lottery. Win your very own storage container. Sponsored by City Hope." He almost laughed. A man behind him did. "What a joke," the man muttered. "Who wants a box full of junk? Might as well raffle off a dumpster." John smiled politely, but something in him refused to join the laughter. He tore off one of the little strips at the bottom of the flyer that listed the address. Sam noticed. "What's that?" he asked. "Nothing," John said. "Just maybe something." That night, after the soup line, they found a dry patch beneath the bridge and made their small fire in a tin can. Sam hugged his knees, watching the flames. "Do you think we'll ever have a house again?" he asked. The question, innocent and cruel in its simplicity, hit John like a blow. He forced a smile. Maybe. Houses take time, but maybe something smaller first. Like what? Like, I don't know, a space of our own, a place that's just ours, even if it's not much. Sam nodded, satisfied with the promise, and yawned. What about the thing on the paper? The contest? The lottery? John looked at the paper again, the edges curling from the heat of the fire. It's probably nothing, kid. They're giving away a storage container. That's just a big metal box. Sam grinned. Then maybe that's our box. John laughed softly. You think so? Yeah, Sam said, his eyes drooping. We could live in it. Paint it red. Call it our ship. The boy's imagination was relentless, pure in a way that made John's throat tighten. He tucked the flyer into his pocket, thinking it was foolish, but letting the idea warm him for a moment anyway. 2 days later, he walked into the City Hope office. The woman behind the desk looked surprised to see him. We don't usually get many entries, she said kindly. It's a free drawing, you know. 1 ticket per person. John filled out the form carefully, his hands trembling slightly. Under address, he hesitated, then wrote, No fixed address, temporary shelter use. The woman didn't comment. She stamped the paper and handed him a small card with a number written on it. For Lurier 47. For the next week, life went on as usual. The bottles, the shelters, the endless walking. He almost forgot about the ticket until the day the volunteers from City Hope came by the soup kitchen with a list of winners. 1 prize only, one of them called out. Container number 914. Winner, John Marshall. At first, John didn't move. It took Sam tugging his sleeve for him to stand. The others clapped and jeered good-naturedly. Hey, look at that! The man's rich now. He's got a box to live in. John smiled awkwardly, but inside a strange flutter of hope stirred. Later, as they walked through the city's industrial district toward the address printed on the claim slip, the air grew heavy with the smell of metal and dust. The storage yard stretched before them like a graveyard of forgotten lives, rows upon rows of rusted containers, their sides streaked with old paint and weather stains. A man in a brown jacket led them to one near the back. There she is, he said. Number 914. Yours now. Been locked up for years. Don't expect much. He handed John a single brass key. You got 48 hours to clear it out. After that, the space goes back to the lot. The key turned stiffly in the lock. When the doors swung open, the stale breath of time escaped a thick smell of damp cardboard, dust, and old wood. Inside was a mountain of things. Broken furniture, torn boxes, a rusted bicycle, and piles of unidentifiable junk. The light from the open door cut a diagonal path across the mess, highlighting particles of dust that danced like ash. Sam stood frozen. This is it? He asked quietly. John's heart sank. Yeah, he said after a moment. Looks like it. The disappointment in his son's voice was sharper than the cold. But as he stepped inside, pushing aside a stack of old magazines, something in him refused to give in. It's not so bad, he said. Some of this could be worth something. Metal scrap, maybe. We'll clean it up, see what's here. Sam frowned. It smells funny. That's the smell of potential, John said with a half smile, though his throat tightened at the absurdity of his own words. They spent the rest of the afternoon sorting through the debris. John stacked pieces of wood outside, setting aside anything that might burn cleanly for firewood. Sam collected stray tools, a cracked baseball, an old pair of binoculars missing one lens. They worked until the sky turned orange. The air inside the container grew thick with dust, and their clothes were streaked with grime. Yet somewhere amid the hopelessness, John felt a flicker of something familiar, a sense of purpose. When the yard manager came by to lock up for the night, he looked at them curiously. You folks really staying here? John shrugged. Just for a while. It's dry. The man hesitated, then nodded. Well, I guess it's yours. Congratulations, I guess. When he left, the yard fell silent except for the creaking of the wind against metal walls. They ate their sandwiches sitting on a broken crate, surrounded by the quiet echo of forgotten things. Sam traced patterns on the dusty floor with his finger. Do you think there's treasure in here? He asked suddenly. John chuckled. What kind of treasure? Like, Gold coins. Or something someone hid. People don't hide gold in places like this, kiddo. Just junk. But maybe someone did. John looked around at the shadows, the piles of boxes, the silence pressing in. For a strange moment, he felt the boy might be right. Not about gold, perhaps, but about something. There was a story buried here. Something that once mattered to someone. He stood and pulled the doors closed against the cold night air, the lock clicking softly into place. "We'll see what's inside tomorrow," he said. Sam nodded sleepily, curling up in a pile of old blankets they'd found. John sat awake for a while, listening to the wind rattle the walls. In the darkness, he reached into his pocket and felt a small piece of paper with the winning number still folded there. Proof that, for once, fate had looked his way. He didn't know that the container would soon reveal more than just forgotten junk. He only knew that for the first time in a long time, he and his son had a roof over their heads, however temporary. And in a world that had taken almost everything, that small victory felt enormous. Outside, the wind died down. Inside, father and son slept beneath layers of old cloth, unaware that beneath the mountain of debris around them, something waited, something that would change their lives forever. The night pressed close around the walls of container number 914, and in the silence, it seemed to breathe. The morning light crept in through the thin gap where the container doors didn't quite meet, cutting a pale slice across the darkness. Dust shimmered in that strip of light like a slow, quiet snowfall. John woke first, his back aching from the hard floor, his fingers numb from the cold that had seeped into the metal walls overnight. He sat up and looked at Sam, who was still wrapped in the old blanket they'd found, his face calm, his lips slightly parted. For a moment, John simply watched him sleep. The boy looked peaceful in a way he hadn't for a long time. That was worth something. When Sam finally stirred, the air inside was still heavy with the smell of old cardboard and rust. "Morning, champ," John said softly. "Hungry?" Sam nodded, rubbing his eyes. They split the last sandwich from the day before, and as they ate, the sound of the waking city began to hum beyond the yard fence. Trucks starting, dogs barking, a distant siren. For the first time in months, John felt like they were in their own place. No matter how temporary, no matter how broken, it was theirs for now. When they stepped outside, the yard manager was making his morning rounds. He gave John a curious glance but said nothing beyond a gruff, "Lock up when you're done." John nodded, grateful to be left alone. He turned back toward the container, its rusted sides gleaming faintly in the sunlight. It looked even more hopeless in daylight, a tomb of forgotten things. But he had promised Sam they'd see what they could find, and he meant to keep his word. They started from the front, pulling out anything too large or heavy to move around. There was a splintered dresser, its drawers missing, a cracked mirror, stacks of disintegrating newspapers from the 1980s, old tax records, and something that might once have been a television, but was now only a hollow frame. The first hour was all dust and disappointment. Sam grew restless, coughing in the thick air. "Poppy, it's just trash," he muttered. "I know, buddy," John replied, wiping his hands on his jeans. "But sometimes trash hides good surprises. You never know." By midday, the sun was bright enough to make the air shimmer above the asphalt. They had cleared enough space to see the back wall. John was sweaty, his shirt sticking to his back, his hands blackened with dirt. He leaned against a pile of broken boxes and took a long sip from one of their water bottles. Sam was sitting cross-legged on the floor, playing with a dusty toy truck he had unearthed from a pile of rags. It was missing a wheel, but the boy rolled it back and forth with quiet concentration. That simple sight, his son playing, smiling faintly, made John's exhaustion ease for a moment. "Let's keep at it," he said finally, pushing himself upright. "We've got a few more hours before the yard closes." Sam sighed but nodded. They moved deeper into the pile where the air smelled mustier, older. Beneath a mountain of warped picture frames and plastic bins, John found a trunk filled with old clothes, stiff with mildew. He tossed them aside, shaking his head. Then something metallic caught his eye in the far corner. The corner that stayed in shadow no matter how much sunlight entered through the open door. He squatted down, pulling at the layers of junk that covered it. A broken lamp, a stack of magazines tied with string. an old vacuum cleaner that had long since died. Underneath it all sat a large object wrapped in stiff, brittle canvas. He brushed off the dust and saw metal edges, a handle, rusted latches. It was a suitcase, or maybe a small trunk, heavy enough that when he tried to lift it, his back protested. "Sam," he called quietly. The boy looked up. "What is it?" "Not sure yet." John tugged at the clasp until one gave with a creak. The other two were more stubborn, but with enough force, they snapped open. Inside was a layer of yellowed papers, neatly stacked and bound with a faded ribbon. Beneath that lay something wrapped in wax paper, a bundle of letters, and next to them, a thick envelope sealed with brittle brown tape. The smell of old paper filled the air, dry and slightly sweet, like the scent of libraries long abandoned. On the topmost paper, in elegant, slanted handwriting, was a single line: "Property of Harper Industrial Solutions, Department of Safety." John's brow furrowed. The name tugged at some distant memory. He sat back on his heels, staring at the label. "I know that name," he murmured. "I used to fix their trucks. Years ago, before—" He didn't finish the sentence. Sam peered over his shoulder. "Is it worth something?" "I don't know. Maybe." John pulled the envelope free. Written across the front, in shaky blue ink, were the words, "For whoever finds this after me." A strange unease rippled through him. The message felt personal, like a whisper reaching out from the past. He turned it over, hesitated, then carefully tore the seal. Inside were several handwritten pages, fragile and yellowed. The first line made him catch his breath. "My name is David Harper. If you're reading this, then I failed to deliver the truth while I still could." He read on, each word sharpening the cold in his chest. Harper wrote about his company, how the owners had stolen pension funds meant for workers, how safety reports had been falsified to cut costs, how men had been injured and silenced. "They buried it all," one line said. "And when I tried to speak, they buried me too. Not in earth, but in fear." John sat motionless for a long time, the letter trembling in his hands. Sam watched him quietly. "Is it bad?" he asked finally. John looked at his son. "It's important," he said softly. "Very important." He set the papers back down and lifted another bundle from the trunk. Photographs this time, black and white and fading. Men in hard hats, standing before a factory sign that read, "Harper Industrial Solutions, 1974. In one photo, the same man who must have written the letter, middle-aged, serious eyes behind thick glasses, stood beside a group of smiling workers. On the back in pencil was written, "They trusted me. I let them down." As the afternoon light shifted toward gold, John sat among the wreckage of forgotten things and tried to make sense of what he'd found. The discovery felt bigger than the container, bigger than him. A life's worth of truth sealed in a metal box, waiting decades for someone desperate enough, unlucky enough, or maybe just foolish enough to find it. He wondered how many other lives had been destroyed by what these papers described. Men who'd worked, paid in sweat and blood, only to die believing the world had forgotten them. Sam, sensing the change in his father's mood, grew quiet. He crawled closer and leaned against him. "What are you going to do, Dad?" he whispered. John didn't answer right away. He stared at the papers again, then at the setting sun slanting across the yard. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but maybe this means something." That night, they didn't sleep inside the container. John wanted to keep the papers safe, away from damp and dust. They walked back to the underpass, the suitcase in the cart between them. It was heavier now, not from its contents, but from what it represented. A weight of responsibility he hadn't expected. They ate in silence, each lost in thought. When Sam finally drifted off, John sat awake, staring at the city lights reflected in puddles along the street. He thought about the man who had written that letter, about how it had ended up in his hands. There was a sense of purpose stirring in him he hadn't felt in years, a faint echo of the man he used to be before everything collapsed. He knew he couldn't do this alone. In the morning, he would take the papers somewhere safe, find someone who could help him understand what he was holding. He didn't yet realize how dangerous that choice would be, or how far it would carry him and his son. All he knew was that for the first time in a long, long while, he had something that wasn't just another day's survival. He had a reason. As he lay down beside his son, listening to the wind rattle through the bridge above, John felt a fragile thread of hope weaving through the darkness. It was thin and trembling, but it was real. Somewhere in the city, justice long buried waited to be unearthed. And in the cold, uncertain hours before dawn, he made himself a silent promise. He would not let the truth die again. The morning after they found the suitcase, the air had a strange stillness to it, as if the city itself was holding its breath. John woke before the sun rose, the sounds of passing cars muffled by fog that hung low over the streets. He sat for a moment, his back pressed against the cold wall of the underpass, listening to the soft breathing of his son beside him. The suitcase lay at his feet, wrapped in an old blanket to keep it dry, though he knew it wasn't the kind of thing water could destroy. What it contained was heavier than metal, heavier than any object he'd ever carried. It was truth, sealed and forgotten. He watched the mist swirl around the lamplight and tried to decide what to do next. He had no lawyer, no money, and certainly no voice anyone would listen to. To the world he was invisible, a man whose opinion had been erased the day he lost his home. But the letter from David Harper had changed something in him. It had cracked open a space he thought long dead, a sense of duty, a belief that maybe what little strength he had left could be used for something that mattered. When Sam woke, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, John already had a plan, though it wasn't much of one. They would go back to the shelter where the volunteers sometimes helped with paperwork, where a woman named Lucy Grant worked. She had kind eyes and the sharp, deliberate way of speaking that made people listen. John didn't know much about her, only that she used to be a lawyer before something happened, as the other men said. Whatever her past, she was one of the few people who treated him like he still had a name. They walked through the morning chill toward the shelter, pushing the cart with the suitcase inside. When they arrived, the place was already buzzing with activity, people lining up for breakfast, volunteers handing out coffee and bread. Lucy stood by the counter, her hair tied back, a clipboard in her hands. She smiled when she saw them. "Morning, John, Sam. You two look like you've been up early." "Yeah," John said, his voice uncertain. "There's something I need to show you." Huh. She studied him for a moment, her expression shifting as she saw the seriousness in his eyes. "All right," she said, setting her clipboard down. "Let's go somewhere quiet." She led them to the small office at the back of the shelter, where the hum of voices faded. When John placed the suitcase on the table and opened it, Lucy leaned forward, curiosity replacing politeness. As John unfolded Harper's letter, his hands shook slightly. He began to read aloud, his voice low but steady. When he finished, the room was silent. Lucy sat back slowly, her eyes wide. This is real," she said half to herself. She picked up one of the documents, scanning it quickly, then another. "These are original company records. Pension funds, safety reports, all of it. Harper Industrial Solutions shut down 20 years ago, but their assets were absorbed by another firm, New Arcadia Engineering. Same executives, new name." She looked up at him, her voice grave. "If these are authentic, you're holding evidence of massive corporate fraud. Maybe worse." John stared at her. "You think someone would care? After all this time?" Lucy's mouth tightened. "They'll care. Maybe not for the right reasons, but they'll care. The question is what happens to you if they find out you have these." The warning hung in the air between them. Sam shifted uneasily beside his father, his small hand resting on John's sleeve. John didn't speak. He was still trying to process what she'd said. Fraud, corruption. The words sounded distant, like something out of a news story that happened to other people. Not to a man living under a bridge, not to someone who had nothing left to lose. Lucy reached across the table, touching the edge of the letter. "I can help you verify these," she said finally. "I still have contacts, people who can authenticate documents quietly. But we have to be careful. If these connect back to anyone still in power, they won't sit quietly while you wave proof of their crimes." John nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" "For now, nothing," she said. "Leave the papers with me. I'll make copies and keep the originals hidden. You'll have to trust me." "I do," he said simply. And he did. There was something in her tone that made trust seem less like a risk and more like a necessity. They spent the rest of the morning in that office, sorting through the documents. Many were brittle, the ink faded but legible expense reports, handwritten notes, correspondence between executives. One letter dated 1978 chilled John to the core. It was addressed to a Mr. Caldwell, thanking him for handling the incident and ensuring no further questions would be raised by the families. Lucy read it twice before folding it carefully. "This isn't just fraud," she whispered. "Someone died." That night, back under the bridge, John lay awake, thinking of the men in those photographs. Hard-working, smiling, proud. Men who had built their lives around loyalty to a company that had betrayed them. He thought of Harper, too, hiding the truth because he was afraid, and then dying with the guilt still in his chest. We're the same, John thought bitterly. Men who lost everything. But the difference was that Harper's truth had found its way into his hands. Maybe that meant something. The next day, Lucy met them at the library. She had spent the night researching. Harper Industrial went bankrupt in 1990, she said as they sat at one of the public computers. But before that, there were several worker deaths labeled accidents, all in the same facility, the same location. She turned the monitor toward him. On the screen was a black and white photograph of the factory. Its nameplate read Harper Industrial Solutions, and beneath it, in faded lettering, the city address was visible. John's heart clenched when he recognized it. "That's the same district where we found the container," he murmured. Lucy nodded. "That building's been abandoned for decades. A lot of storage units and warehouses around there belong to old subsidiaries of the company. The container you won came from that same lot. Whoever ran this lottery didn't realize what was inside." Sam, who had been drawing quietly beside them, looked up. "So Mr. Harper hid the truth in the container, and we found it?" he asked. "That's right," Lucy said gently. "He wanted someone to find it one day, someone brave enough to do what he couldn't." John felt his throat tighten. Brave. It had been years since anyone had used that word about him. He didn't feel brave. He felt tired, uncertain, and scared of making a mistake. But he couldn't unsee what he'd read, couldn't unknow that a man had died for trying to do the right thing. "Lucy," he said finally, "if we tell people about this, they'll come after us, won't they?" She hesitated before answering. "Maybe, but if we don't, then Harper's death and the lives of those workers stay buried, and maybe that's what they're counting on." They sat in silence for a long time, the hum of computers filling the space. Finally, John stood. "I want to do it," he said, "whatever it takes." Lucy met his gaze, her expression both proud and sad. "Then you'd better be ready," she said quietly, "because once this starts, there's no going back." That evening, as they walked back toward the industrial district, John carried the copied papers in his jacket, wrapped in plastic to keep them safe. The fog had lifted, and the air felt sharp with cold. The city lights glowed in the distance, reflecting off the damp pavement. Sam walked beside him, holding his hand. "Are we going to be heroes now?" the boy asked. John smiled faintly. "No, son. We're just going to tell the truth. That's all." "But the truth makes heroes," Sam said simply. John looked down at him, at his small, determined face, and felt a strange warmth bloom in his chest. Maybe the boy was right. Maybe telling the truth, even when you had nothing, was its own kind of courage. By the time they reached the edge of the storage yard, the moon was up, pale and distant. The container stood silent, a hulking shadow among rows of others. John looked at it and felt something like gratitude. It was a strange thing to thank, an old rusted box, but it had given him more than shelter. It had given him purpose. As he lay beside Sam that night, sleep refused to come. His mind churned with images. Harper's desperate handwriting, Lucy's serious eyes, the faceless executives in the letters. Somewhere, men who had built fortunes on lies still lived comfortably, their crimes forgotten. But not anymore. When he finally closed his eyes, he dreamed of gears turning, of machines grinding to a halt, and of voices long silenced rising again. The message from the past had found him, and whether he was ready or not, he knew what it demanded: to be heard. The days that followed were a blur of movement and tension, filled with moments that felt both enormous and painfully small. John had always measured life in simple terms: days survived, meals earned, nights without rain. But now everything seemed to move under a different clock. Each hour carried weight, every decision a shadow that stretched far beyond him. The papers Lucy had copied were now locked away, and the originals she kept in a safe at the shelter. She promised him protection, though both knew that promise was fragile in a world ruled by those with money and power. The first tremor came 3 days after Lucy sent the documents to a journalist named Michael Reed. Michael was one of those men who had spent his career walking the knife's edge between truth and danger, the kind who carried both arrogance and courage in equal measure. When he met John for the first time, he extended his hand with the same ease one might offer to a witness or a suspect. It wasn't trust, but acknowledgement. "Lucy told me you found something big," he said. "I hope you understand what you're getting into." John didn't flinch. "I've lived through worse," he replied. They met in the back of a quiet diner on the city's south side. Michael spread the papers across the table, his brow furrowed as he read through them, page by page. The silence stretched, broken only by the hiss of the coffee machine behind the counter. Finally, he looked up. "This isn't just corporate fraud," he said. "This is a cover-up. Workers died in accidents that were never reported. The company falsified safety inspections, bribed regulators, then shifted the blame to contractors who didn't even exist. And this," he tapped a letter signed by one of the original owners, "this ties it directly to Dale Pritchett." The name hit Lucy like a gunshot. Pritchett? He's not just a businessman now. He's a sitting senator. Michael nodded grimly. "Which means if we publish this, he'll come at us with everything he's got." That night, as John and Sam returned to the bridge, the air felt heavier than usual. John carried the weight of what he'd heard like a stone in his chest. A senator. The thought seemed unreal. All those nights scrounging for coins, all those mornings lining up for soup, and the man responsible for so much misery had built an empire on the backs of the forgotten. The next morning, Michael called. "We're going ahead," he said. "The story runs in 2 days. You'll need to keep your head down. Once it's out, there's no going back." John agreed, though his voice faltered. He looked at Sam, who was playing with a stick, drawing lines in the dirt. How could he explain that telling the truth might put them both in danger? The story hit the papers like wildfire. Corruption and cover-up, new Arcata linked to Harper industrial fraud. Beneath the headline was a photo of Pritchett shaking hands with factory workers decades ago, smiling for the camera. Within hours, the networks picked it up. Online, the story spread faster than the company could contain it. Protesters gathered outside Pritchett's offices. Reporters demanded answers. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the truth had broken through. Then the backlash came. By evening, a second wave of articles appeared, this time painting John as an unstable vagrant chasing attention. "Homeless man claims to expose decades-old scandal," one headline sneered. Others implied he had fabricated the documents, that he had a criminal past, that he was being manipulated by activists. On television, a polished spokesperson dismissed the accusations as delusions of a bitter man. Watching it on the small screen in the shelter, John felt a cold, deep anger settle in his gut. He turned off the TV and sat in silence, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the space where words failed him. Lucy entered quietly, a folder in her hand. "They're trying to bury you," she said softly, "but we can fight it." He looked up at her, his eyes tired but burning. "How? They own everything, lawyers, networks, judges." She placed the folder on the table. Inside were petitions from former workers' families. "Not this time. You're not alone. They've been waiting years for someone to bring this back." Over the next week, the fight deepened. Lucy organized a meeting with several of the families, men and women with weathered faces and eyes full of grief. They gathered in a church basement, the air heavy with the smell of coffee and hope. One old man, his hands trembling, placed a photo on the table. His brother killed in a supposed equipment malfunction in 1979. "We knew it wasn't an accident," he said. "They made us sign papers to keep quiet. Said if we talked, we'd lose everything. Now they're finally going to hear us." John listened, his throat tight. For years, he had thought his pain was private, unique. Now he saw it mirrored in the faces around him. People who had lost homes, families, dignity, all because someone had decided their lives were expendable. It was then that he realized what Harper must have felt when he'd hidden the papers away. The guilt, the fear, the desperate hope that one day someone might finish what he couldn't. But Pritchett was not a man to sit quietly. 2 nights later, as John walked back toward the shelter, a black car slowed beside him. The window rolled down just enough for a voice to emerge, smooth, calm, practiced. "Mr. Marshall," it said, "you've done quite enough. There's no need to make this any worse. We can offer you something, money, a place to live, a clean start. All you have to do is disappear." John stopped in his tracks, his pulse hammering in his ears. The voice continued. "You have a child, don't you? Think about his future. Take the offer. Everyone wins." The car idled, the sound of its engine low and dangerous. For a moment, John thought about it. The warmth of a home, the security of knowing Sam would never go hungry again. It was everything he'd ever wanted, and yet he knew what it meant. Silence bought with guilt. He stepped forward, his voice steady. "You tell your boss I'm not for sale." The car's door opened slightly as if to threaten more, but then it closed again. The engine revved, and the vehicle disappeared into the darkness. John stood there for a long time, the cold wind biting his face, his hands trembling not with fear, but with fury. When he reached the shelter, Sam was already asleep, curled under a blanket Lucy had found for him. John sat beside him and watched his small hand resting over his heart. In that quiet, he remembered his wife's voice, soft and certain. "Don't ever teach him to bend, John. Teach him to stand." The trial began 3 weeks later. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and old paper. Cameras lined the hallway outside, their flashes white and unblinking. Pritchett sat with his lawyers, calm and composed, while Lucy presented the evidence. John sat behind her, silent, his hands clasped tightly together. When the letters were read aloud, the ones where executives joked about buying silence and bearing the story before it breathes, the room fell still. The families wept quietly in the back. When the verdict came, it was short but clear. The court ruled that New Arcata, formerly Harper Industrial, had engaged in systematic fraud and concealment. Pritchett's political career was finished. The families received compensation, and a foundation was established in Harper's name to protect workers' rights. Outside the courthouse, as reporters swarmed around, John said nothing. He only looked up at the gray sky and felt the weight of years lift slightly from his shoulders. Lucy found him there, smiling faintly. "You did it," she said. "No," he replied. "We did." That night, as he and Sam returned to the small room the shelter had given them, the boy asked quietly, "Are we safe now?" John looked at him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "For now," he said, "but the truth isn't about being safe. It's about being right." Sam nodded solemnly, as though he understood more than a child should. When they lay down to sleep, John thought about the container where it had all begun. The rust, the dust, the forgotten silence. What had seemed worthless had given birth to something that could not be bought or buried. Justice. It wasn't clean, and it wasn't easy, but it was theirs. And in that thought, he finally slept without fear. Spring came slowly that year, as if the world itself was hesitant to believe in renewal. The snow melted in gray patches along the sidewalks, and the first green shoots pushed through the soil beside the shelter fence. For the first time in a long while, the air carried not just the chill of survival, but the scent of something that almost felt like peace. The trial was over. The headlines had faded. The city had moved on to new scandals, new tragedies. But for John and Sam, everything had changed. They were no longer living under the bridge or sleeping on cold concrete. Thanks to the settlement funds distributed to those who had brought the evidence forward, the shelter had helped John secure a small mechanic's workshop on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just an old garage with a cracked sign that read, "Marshall Repairs," but it was his. The rent was low, the tools secondhand, and the floor still smelled faintly of oil and rust. But every morning when he turned the key in the door, he felt a quiet sense of belonging. Sam had his own small corner with a desk and books, where he drew designs for cars and engines. each one more elaborate than the last. The boy who once shivered through nights beneath an overpass now came home with chalk dust on his fingers and stories from school. Lucy visited often. She brought by paperwork, helped organize the small foundation that had grown from the court ruling the Harper Fund, established in memory of the man whose hidden truth had set everything in motion. They used the money to provide legal aid and safety training for workers in small factories, the kind of places that rarely saw inspectors unless something went wrong. Lucy called John her partner in justice, though he laughed whenever she said it. "You're the lawyer," he'd tell her. "I just found a box." She always smiled at that. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything, a man who doesn't walk away when he could. One afternoon, as the golden light filtered through the shop windows, John hung a small metal sign beside the door. It was old and dented, but he had cleaned it carefully. Stamped into it were 3 faded numbers, 914. He stood back, wiping his hands on a rag, and for a long moment just stared at it. That number had once been the mark of a forgotten place, a rusted container that nobody wanted. Now it was a reminder not of luck, but of the strange, winding road that had led him and his son out of the dark. Life wasn't easy, not by any stretch. There were still bills, still days when work was slow and meals were simple. But there was laughter, too, the sound of Sam tinkering with an old engine, the smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings, Lucy teasing him for his stubborn pride. And there was the quiet satisfaction that came with knowing he had stood his ground against something bigger than himself and hadn't been broken. Sometimes late at night, when the city was still, and the only sound was the ticking of the old clock in the shop, John would take out Harper's letter, the one that had started it all. The paper had yellowed more since the day he found it, the ink fading around the edges, but the words still held the same power. "If you're reading this, then I failed to deliver the truth while I still could." He always read the next line out loud, a promise to the man who had trusted a stranger across decades. "Don't let them bury what matters." Sam once asked him why he kept that letter framed on the wall. John smiled and said, "Because it reminds me that even the smallest voice can be heard if it tells the truth loud enough." The boy had nodded, thinking it over, then said something that made John's heart swell. "Then I'll build machines that help people hear better." That was Sam, always taking words and turning them into dreams. When summer came, the foundation held its first public event in the park. Families of former Harper workers attended, along with activists, factory laborers, and city officials. Lucy gave a short speech about justice and redemption, and then she invited John to the stage. He hated speaking in front of crowds, but he couldn't refuse. Standing there, he looked out at the faces, the men and women who had once been silenced now gathered together, free of fear. He cleared his throat and said simply, "I didn't plan to be part of this. I just wanted a place to keep my son warm. But sometimes when life gives you nothing, that's when you finally see what something really means." A man named David Harper left a message behind. He asked whoever found it to finish what he started. "I just tried to do that. The rest you all did yourselves." The applause was quiet at first, then it swelled, not like a roar, but like a wave that rose and fell softly. In that sound, John felt the weight of all those lost years lift from him. He looked up at the sky, its blue streaked with gold, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man who had lost everything. He felt like someone who had found his way home. After the event, as the sun began to sink, he and Sam walked back through the streets toward their small house at the edge of town. Sam carried a paper cup of lemonade, swinging it carelessly, and talked about building a small go-kart with an old lawnmower engine they'd found at a junkyard. John listened, smiling. "You think it'll run?" he asked. "It'll fly," Sam said confidently. "You'll see." When they reached the house, the porch light flickered on, casting a soft glow across the yard. John paused before stepping inside and looked back once more at the horizon. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and somewhere beyond them, in the forgotten corners of that industrial yard, Container 914 still stood, locked and empty. But it wasn't forgotten anymore. Inside, the workshop smelled faintly of oil and warm metal. The walls were covered with drawings, some of cars, some of machines, and one of a large rusted container with the words "Our First Home" written underneath in Sam's careful handwriting. John laughed when he saw it. "You know," he said, "I think that's the only house I ever owned that didn't have a roof leak." Sam grinned, and they both laughed until their sides hurt. Later after dinner, as the crickets began to sing outside and the world settled into the hush of night, Sam looked up from his bed. "Dad," he said, his voice sleepy, "are we rich now?" John smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his son's forehead. "No, son," he said softly. "We're not rich, but we're home, and that's better." The boy nodded, already half asleep, and murmured, "I like home." John sat there for a while, listening to the quiet, then stood and went to the window. The moonlight lay silver across the yard, and in that light the number 914 glowed faintly on the door of the garage. He thought of Harper, of Lucy, of all the people who had stood beside him, and whispered, "We did it." In the stillness, there was no reply, but he didn't need one. The truth had spoken for itself. It had changed lives, rebuilt faith, and carved a home out of ruins. And as John turned off the light and stepped into bed, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Sometimes the smallest discoveries could lead a man not to riches, not to glory, but to something far greater, the quiet, enduring grace of having done the right thing. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. More true-to-life stories like this are coming soon. Share this video with someone who believes that even the smallest act of courage can change everything. And before you go, check out the next video. You won't believe how that one ends.